Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the first of a double bill today. We've got another show later on about the minesweeping. But all this week, we are examining the Scheldt campaign of 80 years ago. To kick us off, Dutch historian and author Tobias van Gent joins us to offer his perspective on this often overlooked battle. He is the co-author of a Dutch language book, probably the definitive Dutch language book. Links to buy that in the description below. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon. How are you today?
Well, thank you, Paul. I'm very well. Well, actually, this weekend we had some huge commemorations on the bed of the Scheldt 80 years ago. And I even had to give a speech in the church of Vlissingen. And the Undersecretary of Defense was there as well. So it shows you that there's much more attention being given to the bed of the Scheldt recently.
Brilliant. We just had a little internet issue there for a second, but hopefully it's back again now. Tell us about your background, particular interest in the battle come from yourself.
Well, I'm a historian, but Zeeland is famous in the Netherlands, but also among Germans, actually, and more Belgium and French as well, as a place for holidays because we have wonderful beaches. And at a very young age, I was already walking around in Zeeland because I wasn't born here in this part of the Netherlands. And you can see many, many remains of the Atlantic Wall. So as a historian, I was from a very young age immediately intrigued about the Atlantic Wall and all the events that took place over here. And luckily, well, something like 25 years ago, back then I was actually a teacher, a naval officer, and teaching at the Naval Academy in the Netherlands, the Dutch version of Annapolis, I could say. But I moved to Middelburg, and I currently work at the Roosevelt University College as a military historian. So I'm very on the spot now itself. And as a military historian, my field of specialty is the Second World War. So it was inevitable that I would write something and would do research on the Battle of the Scheldt.
Well, brilliant. Well, you've come armed with a PowerPoint. So, folks, fire away with questions, although there's a lot of slides, a lot of information coming from Tobias today. So I think your questions will probably be answered as we go along. But I hand over to our guest to give his very specific Dutch point of view on this, which I'm looking forward to. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, well, I will start with the main military strategical issue. Here we can see the whole campaign in Northern Europe, which starts at D-Day 6th of June and exactly ends 11 months later. And if you think about this campaign, we always think about four big battles. The Battle of Normandy, the Battle of Arnhem, Operation Market Garden. Everybody knows the Battle of the Bulge, and the Rhine crossing, think of the Battle of Remagen, has been important as well. And we argue, and me, that's also me and my co-author, we didn't seem to forget a fifth very important battle, and that was the Battle of the Scheldt.
Yeah.
And it was actually a very essential battle. And well, let me give you immediately a quote of Eisenhower himself. In 1946, he gave a speech at the Canadian capital in Ottawa, and he stated over there, "We knew that the end of Nazism was in sight when the first ship could sail up to Antwerp." Now, the Battle of the Scheldt, and maybe you could show the next slide. We all know that there was something like a 2 months heavy fighting in Normandy, a severe fighting, and only at something in the beginning of July, finally, the German resistance was broken. And on this map, you can see a very rapid, strong advance through Belgium. It's actually called the Allied Blitzkrieg, because you have to see, Paris was liberated in the end of August, and less than a week later, they already had liberated Belgium. And the Allied advance seemed unstoppable. But then a problem occurred. Next slide, please. Because those were logistics. You see a picture of the French armored division. Now, armored division back then had something like 350 tanks and a tenfold on trucks, jeeps, armored vehicles, and so on. So they were using an enormous amount of fuel. And compared that to the Germans, who were still using, and also the Red Army, a massive amount of horses. So they were using an enormous amount of fuel. And all those supplies needed to come all the way back from Normandy. So the further they were advancing, the more problematic the supplies were to be. And you can also see that on the next slide again, where we can see the whole advance. You can actually see, if you see the major ports, the Germans actually, they had to retreat quite rapidly, but they tried to keep their hands on their ports. You can see Le Havre and a little bit north, Boulogne, Calais. And if the Allies were able to conquer such a harbor, then the Germans would make sure that everything was destroyed. So the logistic problems were actually severe. But then the solutions was in sight, and you can see that on the next slide. Because then suddenly Antwerp, oh, I see a spelling error. It's on the 4th of September. And the advance was so rapidly, they were immediately moving into Antwerp. They were also supported by Belgian resistance. But what was actually very important is that the Germans had to surrender so rapidly that they didn't have time to make any destruction to the harbor facilities of Antwerp. So Antwerp was one of the largest harbors in the world, and everything was still intact, including the whole railway system, cranes, all kind of storage. So Antwerp seemed to be the solution. But the only way to get to Antwerp by ship was to first liberate the Scheldt. And that was actually a problem that then occurred. Could you show the next slide, Paul? Because then there was a massive debate between Eisenhower and Montgomery. And Eisenhower was also pointing out Montgomery because he was in charge at the northern part of the campaign. So the 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd British Army. So Antwerp was in his theater of war. But Montgomery was very much focused on ending the war as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And he wasn't thinking in logistics. He said, no, give me all the supplies you have. Stop the advance of the Americans, which was it's immensely frustrating to Bradley, but certainly to Patton, because we know Patton, he also had the mentality to make risking advances. And give all the supplies to me, and I will try to end the war before the end of the year. And that's, we can see that on the next slide, became the infamous Operation Market. Now, that was discussed yesterday. I always say about Market Garden, it's also a little bit the PR surrounding Market Garden,
Yeah.
because the way it's being sold, they always say, it was only the final bridge. Only if they would have taken the bridge of Arnhem, then. And I think this is a huge exaggeration, because there were so many problems to advancing the troops towards Arnhem, that even if they would have taken the bridge across the Rhine, and of course Frost had it in his hands, but he had to surrender, then I don't think that the Allies had enough supplies, enough troops available that actually to make the final thrust towards Berlin. And it's still something like 600 kilometers. So there's this enormous exaggeration of Arnhem. But the enormous focus Montgomery had, and not only Montgomery, but also Dempsey, the commander of the Second Army, but also Horrocks, the Armored Corps commander, they completely had neglected Antwerp. And if you see on the map Antwerp, if they would only had advanced 20, 30 kilometers to the north, they could have locked off Zeeland, and they didn't. And now we can see on the next slide what actually happened. There was a complete army, the German 15th Army, that was actually much more already surrounded or cut off in Belgium and in the north of France. The fact that they did not cut off Zeeland from the south, it enabled this complete army of almost 90,000 men and many supplies, cannons, and so on to escape. And even the Germans were astonished by this success. And it was even called the German Dunkirk. And we can see in the picture exactly what happened. The 15th Army had a way to freedom from the south, and they immediately were being sent to North Brabant, so the area in the south of the Netherlands, to attack the Market Garden. So actually, this is I would even call it a blunder that they managed. The Germans actually got the opportunity to have a complete army to be escaped. So this whole Market Garden had, from the Dutch perspective as well, it did not end the war in 1944, and with the neglection of Zeeland, Hitler now had at least a month to strengthen his defensive in Zeeland. And we for our book, we did some research. We were quite sure that there were so few troops still in the beginning of September. If they would have pursued their attack after Antwerp, they could have occupied maybe Zeeland with much less effort. And of course, this is a little bit what-if history, which is always dangerous. But we knew actually the position of the most German forces. Once Antwerp fell, Hitler understood much better than Montgomery the importance of the Scheldt. He immediately called that the southern part of the Westerschelde should have become Festung Zuid, so the fortification in the south, and the island of Walcheren on the north of the mouth of the Schelde also became officially a Festung. And it means in German military doctrine, it should be defended until the last. And he also immediately gave the assignment to put as many mines as possible into the Scheldt, because he understood better, apparently, than Montgomery, the strategical importance of Antwerp. Next slide, please. So Montgomery wasted at least a month, and only in the beginning of October he started his advance and to free the Westerschelde from the German occupation. And here you can see the whole map from our book of the Battle of the Westerschelde. And it's a complicated battle, because I always say you see several theaters of war. Complete to the right, you can actually see the fighting in Brabant, which was very intense because the Germans had stormgeschütz over there, and they even had some paratroopers who were considered still a kind of an elitist force. You have the south of the Mount of the Scheldt, and you have the area which is called Zuid-Beverland, and they had to advance also to a very narrow opening towards Zeeland. And you have complete to the corner in the left, you see the west of Zeeuws-Vlaanderen, which was one of those fortifications, Festung Zuid, so fortification south. This fortification actually held out for a month. There's no fortification, no Festung in the whole campaign of 1944-1945 that was able to hold on as long as Festung Zuid. But I want to focus in this presentation mainly on the climax of the battle, and that was the occupation of Walcheren, which you can see on the north. Now, this is actually the map, an official German map of all the fortifications they had installed on Walcheren. So you can see it's immense. Walcheren was part of the Atlantic Wall, and although it's not a very big area, it's something like 25,000 square kilometers. It actually has something like 300 bunkers and 6 coastal batteries. And well, this is, I wouldn't say typical German, but they all gave their complexes, their positions names. Maybe you can see it on the map. They're named after operas. So it's we have Fiedelo, we have Edelweiss, Zauberflotte. Well, the Germans are a culture-loving people, but even their bunker complexes are then named after operas. So this is the whole map of Walcheren, and now let's zoom in the next slide. This is actually the most important one, because this was Vlissingen Fortress. Of the 300 bunkers, there were something like 200 located around Vlissingen, and Vlissingen was seen as the most important position in the Netherlands of the Atlantic Wall. Because if you control Vlissingen, no ship could pass the Westerschelde towards Antwerp. That was really impossible. Now, and the fortification for Vlissingen was so well defended that it even had 2 forms of fortifications. One in the back, which we can see on the next slide. It's the land fort. So there was a whole system of fortification. Well, maybe you can go back one more time to the previous slide. We can see those bunkers there up north of Vlissingen. And we have the bunkers actually protecting Vlissingen from attack from the sea, and that's called the sea fort. So a land fort and a sea front. So, and we can see on the next slide again of the land fort, they even had dug anti-tank channels. There were a lot of bunkers over there. And you know, the Atlantic Wall was a very sophisticated defensive line. So with many different armaments and bunkers that could cover themselves and could give cover to each one of them. So it was a very strong bunker. There's an intriguing thing about this land front, which we can see on the next slide. Because the land front is still there, almost completely intact. So we still have the anti-tank channel, which you can see over there, and something like 40 different bunkers. And the intriguing thing now is, and I always see this as a way that I even say this, the people in Zeeland have come to peace with their past, because after the war, most of the bunkers were actually immediately destroyed. Okay, let's get rid of them. They remind us of the German occupation. We don't want to see any bunkers. But they were so well constructed that it was actually quite some effort. It took quite some effort to destroy them. And then something like 25 years ago, to the effort of some local historians who said you should not destroy those bunkers, you should keep them. It's part of our cultural military inheritance. And very intriguing enough, they now actually have an official protection by the government. It's called a status of a monument, so it's being seen now as a monument. And we can see on this picture, the one in the right corner, this is completely renovated like it looked in 1944. This is a German bunker, but it's actually camouflaged like a farmhouse. So from the air they couldn't see it. And we can even see aanleg bunkerhoed. It means they even have now for tourists, for cyclists, for people that they can make a whole bunker tour. And it's intriguing to see that so 80 years after the war, our attitude towards the war has changed. Of course, there are not many people who have experienced the German occupation, which was, of course, very intense for many people in the Netherlands. But our attitude towards the war has changed. And it was also nice to see when we had our commemoration this weekend, how many people attend, and also young people. So there's a growing attention to the Battle of Scheldt, and then also of all the remains we have. And I'm not a bunker expert, but I do know several of them. What we still have in Zeeland, the remains of the bunker, this is quite unique. Okay, the next slide, please. Now, the biggest issue actually were, of course, not all those bunkers, but especially the coastal batteries. And there were in total 6 coastal batteries that could seal off the entrance of the Scheldt. And in total, they had 25 guns. Now, here you see a photograph. This is actually the biggest gun they had. It's a 22 centimeter. Now, you can shoot way beyond the horizon. You see over there in the right corner, this is also one of those coastal bunkers. And sometimes I make a joke towards my student and say, those German artillerymen had camouflage being dressed like a female from Walcheren, which is, of course, not the case. But this was left after the war. And there are many pictures, actually, also of people from Zeeland. This is a typical dress with the people here locally were dressed once. You can see this picture as well. But of course, you can imagine that this coastal battery is actually quite vulnerable, especially from attacks from the air. And most of the coastal batteries actually were not that unprotected, which you can see on the next slide. Most coastal batteries are actually much more modern. In the right corner, you can actually see one of the most important coastal batteries. That's the battery of Dishoek. And it had 4 very well camouflaged, but also very well protected guns. And you can actually see this is it's almost a stair, but then the upside down. This was especially constructed by the Germans, also from the pressure of the air. So if bunkers would be hit, then also the pressure of the air would be released. And this is almost impossible to destroy from an aerial attack. Now, the importance of the Dishoek battery can also be shown by these are 2 pictures. On the picture on the right corner, the general walking over there is actually the General von Zangen, the commander of the 15th Army. And the photograph on the left, you can actually maybe recognize, and this is Erwin Rommel standing in the front. So we do know that all major generals, in this case Marshal Rommel, were also visiting the Atlantic Wall in Walcheren before, of course, the attack came. So it's another proof how important also these fortifications were seen by the Germans themselves. But they were considered the prime target for the Allies because they had to get rid of those 6 coastal batteries in order to free the passage to Antwerp. Now, in order to do that, they made an enormous plan. You can show the next slide. Now, it's in Dutch, but this is actually the official pamphlet that was thrown off above Walcheren on the 2nd of October. And it actually says in the big letters, waarschuwing means warning. It's a warning from the Allied headquarters and the Allied commander. And it says the following on the one. It's very probable, which is a kind of weird text. You say something is probable, like, it was going to happen. So don't say probable. That the enemy forces and installations on your islands will have to suffer a very long and heavy aerial bombardment. So they were warning the civilians that they're going to bomb German positions. But then, second, It's the deepest desire of the Allied High Command that we will spare as many civilians as possible. Which, of course, well, that's something you should always strive for. But then 3, and then it becomes really suspicious for the people in Zeeland. It's not only the threat of an aerial bombardment, but also a danger of a flooding. And now the people in Zeeland really get nervous, because maybe you do know the expression, God created the world except for the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was created by the Dutch.
Yeah.
Large parts of the Netherlands are under sea level, and this also applied very much to Walcheren. So Walcheren was protected by dykes, but over the history, the people in Zeeland, and especially in Walcheren, had to deal with floodings all the time. So if you get this warning that a flooding could appear, then you can understand how angry, but also how frightful the people became. Then if you look at 4, this is the advice they were giving to the civilians. You should leave the islands, which is ridiculous because there was no way you couldn't get off the islands anymore. It was completely surrounded. And if that's not possible, go onmiddellijk, which means immediately, with your family to a safe place. Now, nobody in Zeeland and none of the civilians did have any clue what could be a safe place. So this was quite a scary pamphlet that has been thrown out over there. And then only 24 hours later, the following slide disappeared above Walcheren. The Lancaster bombing, a strategical bombing plane, and they were sent out to bomb the dikes in Walcheren, one specific dike. And it's hard to imagine it, but they actually sent in almost 250 Lancaster bombers to destroy one dike. And the reason for this was, of course, quite clear. The Lancaster bomber, strategical bomber, is used to what we call tapestry bombardment, another precision bombardment. So they were simply saying we have to destroy one dike, so let's throw in 250 of those planes. Now we can see on the next picture what happened. You see on the left corner, you see actually this is Westkapelle, so the small town, city that was over there. And you can see destructions, but you can see on the right picture as well, there are many holes already in the dikes, but not only the dike was bombed, but many in the total area as well. So the town of Westkapelle was also heavily damaged, and more than 150 people died during this bombardment as well. So another definitely case for collateral damage. And this happens, of course, if you send in so many bombing planes. But they need to destroy the dikes. But on the next picture, you can see what they were claiming. This is actually from a newspaper from England, and it's an intriguing lineup. So the RAF bombs and sinks a Dutch island. And you can actually see over there, we see the breach wall, we see the watering flooding in, and there we see the village. But there was a second line in there as well, and it said the RAF sinks a Dutch island to silence the German guns. So that was the ultimate goal. So the goal was finally by the Canadians, okay, we should simply flood the islands and then we get rid of the coastal batteries and of the German guns. But we can see on the next slide, that was actually not the case. Because ultimately, you can see way to the left, you see Westkapelle, where they had the gap in the dikes. But they actually bombed another gaps in the south, which is the Nolle Gap, Fort de Ruiter Gap, and one in the north, which is called the Vere Gap. They even put more gaps in the dike to finally let the water in. Now, you can also see over here, 80% of the of Walcheren is then on the water. However, we can see the coastal batteries. They were all located high up in the dunes, and they were secured. And I've had many discussions also with some Canadian historians said, yes, but they could no longer be supplied. Now, we find German documents in the archives. Most of those fortifications of the Atlantic Wall had their own ammunition stores. And we found a document 2 days before the Allied attack, when they attacked the island itself. And they had hundreds of grenades still at the batteries. But other people said, yes, but they could no longer communicate with each other. Well, this is also nonsense because they all had their own generators. Actually, the Atlantic Wall, the whole idea behind the Atlantic Wall was that the fortifications could defend themselves separately and independently. And they even had defensive lines in the back. So whatever they flooded, they certainly did not silence the German guns. They were actually all still intact. And you can see it also on the photograph to the right.
Yep.
Here you can see again the hole in the Westkapelle area. Then you see the town, which is heavily bombed. But W15 is actually the name of the German battery, and it's still dry. So none of the cannons were actually silenced by. And I'm very skeptical about the military effect of this inundation. It's actually called an offensive inundation because we all do know that water, and especially the Dutch, have quite a reputation in the past that they would flood parts of their lands to protect themselves, but a defensive line. This is one of the few examples of an offensive inundation, but I'm very skeptical about the result because they did many destruction to the civilian properties, and it didn't bring them that much in military terms. I do know that the commander-in-chief of the Canadian Army stated the following: well, we don't have to, maybe we don't gain as much by bombing the island, but we don't lose as much as well. But this is very much a military perspective. From a civilian perspective, that was completely different.
I just wanted to thank you for that perspective, because we've talked a lot about the strategic bombing, and there is this point by this time of 1944, the Allies do have lots of bombers, they do have lots of this, and they're kind of just going to use it anyway, whether it has a direct purpose or not. So, are you going as far as saying it was a waste of time? It shouldn't have happened. The bombing.
My co-author quite rightly said the only other operation with offensive inundation is actually from fiction. And that is from Lord of the Ring, when Isengard is destroyed by water. But that's the only other example he came with. No, but I think I want to look at it from the Canadian perspective as well. They already had sustained many losses. It was very heavy fighting. They were short in men. So there's this famous book about Ellis, who is called Brutal Force, which is also explaining the German military doctrine in 44-45. It's understandable that if you have such an advantage in air power, but also in artillery, that you will use it to save your lives. And we also know it's not precision bombardment because they were simply unable to do so. So we do. I read a report from a Canadian report from another town, also in Zeeland, but not in Walcheren. And after the battle, they were actually measuring up how many of the grenades would be fell within 100 yards of their goal, and the answer was 5%. Yeah. So it meant that from the 100 grenades, 59 were. But from their perspective, understandable as well. I think it has changed our philosophy of warfare. Luckily, we have now very much precision weapons, and so it's easier to reduce civilian casualties. But we do know from the Ukraine, and we do know from in Gaza that there are still many civilian casualties as well. But in this case, the whole island was flooded. And I have some pictures you can see on the next slide. This is also one more argument. One of the arguments that was also put forward to justify the bombardment, that it broke the morale of the Germans. And it's indeed the case that the Germans that were defending Walcheren, they didn't have a very high morale, but that didn't have so much to do with the German bombardment. The commander of the division, it was the 70th Division of the German Army, it was a reserve division. And he already stated, once I retreated all my forces to Walcheren, because the rest of Zeeland was already occupied, the morale already had been broken. And it was no longer a fighting unit. They had already sustained many losses in other theaters of war in the Battle of the Scheldt. They were already very much reduced in strength, and the morale was also weakened. And to make it even more explicit, this was a very special division. It was actually a division of people that were physically unable to serve. But there was such a shortage of manpower in the German army that in the end, that troops that were seen as physically unable to serve in the army were still mobilized in the end to fight. And this division was also called the stomach division because they were all struggling with severe stomach problems. And they were put together in one unit. So they could also have a joint diet. And therefore, the division was sometimes also called the white bread division. So apparently, due to the stomach issue, they only eat white bread. And we do know from the equipment they had, well, you can see them on bicycles over there, they only had mainly French equipment from the 1940 army, which the Germans had, of course, taken, and they hardly had any anti-aircraft guns. They hardly had any anti-aircraft guns. So it was never. One Canadian report stated of the military intelligence, it was certainly not Hitler's favorite division. So to break the morale of such a division, which already was broken by put the whole island of Walcheren under water, was a little bit ridiculous. But on the next slide, you can also see what it meant for the civilians. Well, this it meant actually. There were only a couple of areas that were built a little bit higher that remained dry, but most of the houses you can see over there, they were all flooded. And well, it was devastating. If your house is underwater, and in the end it was underwater for a couple of months, it was actually most of them were severely destroyed. You can see in the other picture, this is Middelburg, which is the center of the island, the town where I live and where the University College Roosevelt is. Most people had to retreat to Middelburg because it was one of the few areas that was still dry. Next slide, please. Now, the fact that the Canadians had done this also led to political issues, because it was actually the plan of Lieutenant General Simmons, who was seen as a very promising, talented Allied Canadian commander. But he took over the command of Korea, who had also a disease. And he was actually, Montgomery was quite fond of him. But we can see that in the Battle of the Scheldt, it was his idea to flood the island. And, well, I'm sometimes thinking if Korea had become sick and if he would still in command, it's doubtful that maybe he would have flooded the island as well. The Dutch government in exile, led by Peter Gebrandi, which you can see in the middle, they were not informed at all. They were hearing on the BBC radio that they had completely flooded Walcheren. So he was completely upset about it. I've read the report of the cabinet, and one of the ministers said, it's complete nonsense what they have done. It won't help them to flood Walcheren. So Gebrandi immediately went to Winston Churchill and said, what have you done? And Winston Churchill had to reply, I didn't know either. It has been strictly a military decision. Now, we do know in modern warfare that the generals don't get the free hand like this anymore. But in this case, it was also, well, the Dutch would have never probably allowed the flooding of Walcheren. On the other hand, now they had to deal with a fait accompli, as it is called. So at the same night, there was this Dutch radio broadcast from London, which was called Radio Orange, because the royal family was called the Orange family. And now they were saying that it was a very good bombardment, and of course it meant a lot of sacrifices, but these were necessary sacrifices that the people in Zeeland had to bring for the liberation. So in the end, there was nothing else that they could do. But it's an intriguing if you see the political debate surrounding the inundation of Walcheren as well. Next slide, please. Now that was even not enough, because this happened in the beginning of October, and it was still a full month, and the Canadians gave a whole list of 33 positions of the Germans that needed to be bombed on this tiny island of Walcheren. And in a month time, there were 1,000 airplanes in those weeks that were constantly bombing the position of the Germans. But it was completely useless, because I mentioned already the coastal battery of Dishoek that was attacked on, I believe it was the 28th of October, by 60 Lancaster bombing planes. And it threw off a couple of hundreds of bombs. After the bombardment, there was only one cannon that was not operational. And do you know why? Because it was completely covered in sand. And after a day shoveling, the cannon was operational again. Of those immense bombardments, in the end, only 2 guns were actually with lucky hits out of order, but many collateral damage still, and also because some bombs weren't thrown on German position, but on civilian targets, many killings as well. There's even this story that I think it was Air Marshal Teller, which was a high-ranking British Air Force commander. He went to Eisenhower and said, "Can we please stop using bomber command for those bombardments of the Walcheren island, because it's making no use. Let us bomb German cities." And it's it won't bring you anything to bomb Walcheren so much because we cannot destroy those positions from the air. Now, knowing that you cannot destroy positions from the air, there's only one way that you can do, and that you can see that on the next slides. That is to attack Walcheren from 3 sides. And this occurred on the 1st of November. And you can see in the middle, you can see Walcheren that's being flooded. You see Middelburg, which is still high and dry. But Walcheren was finally attacked from 3 sides. And you can see actually all the units involved. Royal Marine Commandos, also the 52 Lowland Division of the British forces. And you can also see the Royal Naval, Royal Artillery, because you can see this on the next slide. The Allies needed to have boots on the ground, but they threw in many supports. The cannon, the 25-pounder, there were certainly something like 300 guns that were pointing at Walcheren and were supporting the attack on Walcheren. There was a massive support by Tactical Air Force. And we do know on the first day of the landings, there were at least 600 attacks by fighter bombers. And there was hardly any German anti-aircraft guns. And they were also using an awful lot of rockets. And don't forget the battleship Warspite, with I think it's 38 centimeter guns, so it could shoot much further than any German also battery. So massive support to the operation. But the operation was an attack on 3 places. Now we can see that in the next slide. The first attack occurred at Vlissingen. And Vlissingen, they only had to cross the Westerschelde from Breskes, which is something like 15 kilometers. So it's not a long trip. And they did this quite wisely. They did it under the cover of the night. So in the very early morning of the 1st of November, they landed at Vlissingen. And it really took the Germans at least an hour to be aware that there was already a bridgehead. And this was actually done by the Royal Marine Commandos, British forces, but there were also French commandos. Those were the same ones that had fought in D-Day, including Commander Philippe Kieffer. And there were also some Dutch commandos involved because there were also Dutch commanders, and of course they could speak very well Dutch, so they were also seen as very important. So the beachhead wasn't that problematic, but on the next slide you can see this is actually the monument which is still there, and there we also had the ceremony outside to commemorate the landing, which occurred 80 years ago. But they still had to penetrate the city itself, and there was still 3 days of very heavy fighting. And the Germans actually had turned Vlissingen into a kind of fort. So there were bunkers almost everywhere. There was shooting from street corners. There is also a huge shipyard. And they were using the cranes for snipers. And the story was actually that the Royal Marines and later on the brigade of the 52 Lowland Division were actually using flamethrowers to shoot snipers from the crane. So it was very heavy fighting. Now on the next slide, this is the Vlissingen Boulevard, one of the most beautiful boulevards. This is how it looked after the liberation. And there's a famous story that Vlissingen counted something like more than 6,000 houses. But the story was, and this is officially what the city government actually reported, that there was only 1 house that came to the war without any scratch.
Wow.
So it says something about the devastation. So Vlissingen beachhead was secured, but then a second beachhead. And this is the assault on Walcheren on Westkapelle. So where they first had blown the hole in the dykes, they also had the landing over here. And this is very good to realize. I always call this is the second D-Day. It's the only time since 6 June that there was an assault from the sea on the Atlantic Wall, a frontal assault on the sea. And so you can imagine how severe that must have been. And the big difference was with Vlissingen is that they were now coming from Ostende, which is a harbor town in Belgium. So they actually had to sail much longer. And the Royal Navy therefore decided, we better not land on the cover of the night because maybe we have collisions of ship. We want to have a clear sight. The problem only was that not only the Royal Navy had a clear sight, but also the German coastal batteries. You can even say that in the case of D-Day, a lot of German coastal batteries were no longer functional. In this case, they were. So we can see this even on the next slide. There was a immense devastation being done under the supporting fleet of the British. There was a supporting fleet of smaller crafts. You can see it over here with cannons on there. 9 of them were sunk and 10 of them were heavily damaged. And it's even later on called, it was a big success actually of the German coastal batteries because they could shoot, they had a very good vision and they could shoot at the ships and they, they were, of course, they were trying to shoot back, but the coastal guns were so good protected that it hardly did anything. Still, some say due to the sacrifice of all those naval ships, the amount of casualties was almost up to 200 men actually died also when the ship sunk. We can see it on the next slide. They were able to establish a beachhead and then continue. Now, what you see on this picture, this is taken shortly after the landing of Westkapelle, is also very intriguing because we can see tanks and there are also a couple of bulldozers, but we all see them stuck in the water. Now, this is another argument I always bring up when I say that the inundation of Walcheren didn't have a point. And that is that if the Allies had an advantage, it was an advantage in armored vehicles. And actually, there was this famous British armored division. I think it's the 89th, which have also
79th, yeah,
with the German Krabs and the church. They actually was sending in something like 24 of those to support the attack. After 24 hours, there were only 4 operational. Most of them actually got stuck in the water and sunk in the water. So the flooding of Walcheren also denied them the possibility to actually use those armored vehicles they had. And most of them got stuck. Now, this is actually the monument we can still see on the dike of Westkapelle. It's actually one of those Germans that got stuck and was flooded in the water. And after the war, it was actually put on the dike in commemoration of the Battle of the Scheldt. Next slide. Now, this is the very famous lighthouse of Westkapelle, which is actually on top of a church from the late Middle Ages, and it's a very important thing in the. So, if you see this lighthouse, you immediately know it's Westkapelle. We can see the Royal Commandos now moving into Westkapelle, and on the next slide, photograph on the right, you can actually see them taking German prisoners. Now, with those commandos, again, British Royal Commandos, there were also Dutch commandos again, but also from Norway, from Belgium. So it was actually an international enterprise and very intriguing. On the picture you see on the right, you see this commando which is guarding those German prisoners. He was actually a German as well. In the commandos that were fighting at Westkapelle, there was also a small troop of German Jews that had fled Germany shortly before the war, were very eager to fight to liberate Germany, and they were finally, after many interrogations, they were accepted within the ranks of the Royal Navy, and they actually were fighting under a false name because everyone knew that if they would be captured with a Jewish name, but also with a German name, that their life was certainly not secure. But they could speak fluent German, so they were also seen as an enormous asset. It says something again on the international enterprise. I have to make one correction because I know how sensitive it is. The commandos actually are partly the Royal Marines. So in Westkapelle, they were Royal Marines commandos from the Navy. Vlissingen, however, were commandos from the Army. Before the Army commander will say something about it. For the Royal Marines, Westkapelle is still seen as one of the biggest operations in the war. And we still see today Royal Marines coming to Westkapelle to commemorate the operation they conducted over there, because it's seen actually by them as also as one of the most severe heavy fightings they had to undertake. Next picture. Now they had secure a beachhead in Westkapelle. They had to go all the way to the dunes by foot because they couldn't use any armored vehicles or any form of equipment. And one after the other, they had to conquer all those German coastal batteries. And we can see actually over here that this is one of the pictures they took once they took a German position with the flag. Going to the dunes, so it was extremely hard for them, and it took them another 2 days to capture all the coastal batteries. And the final coastal battery they were able to take was the one at Dishoek, which is quite close to Vlissingen. It was again a tremendous finding because the first attack in the night was a failure. and they had to attack again the next morning. And there were also many commanders were actually wounded or killed. But once this final battery was taken, immediately Montgomery sent out a messenger to Eisenhower saying, I've taken the final battery, which was actually also the sign that the minesweepers could come up and try to clear the Western Scheldt of the mines. There's one more thing I have to say as well, because I know it's an important discussion. So, I'm critical about the invasion of Walcheren, but you have to be aware, and you don't have to go back to the slide with all the German defensive, but most German defensives were in the dunes. Although there were bunkers also in the inland of Walcheren, they were not forming any form of defensive lines. So it was not that if you would flood them, so the bunkers that were on Walcheren itself were communication bunkers or headquarter bunkers, or sometimes a bunker where they would store an artillery piece. But with the flooding of Walcheren, you did not destroy defensive line. The only defensive line they did destroy was the land front, or let's say the position in Vlissingen in the rear. But instead of using that by attacking Vlissingen from the rear, they still attacked Vlissingen at the seafront. So any advantage they would have been getting out of flooding the bunkers within Walcheren itself, they didn't use it because they still attacked Vlissingen from the front.
Right.
That's how it is. And then we have the third attack, which is the Sloedam, which of course is also going to be mentioned in one of the future television series.
Yeah.
But it's important to know there is a movie on Walcheren. I will show you some pictures also in the end. And there's a huge recording on this attack. But it was the third attack. And the intriguing thing is also from a military strategical perspective. On the other side of the Sloedam, so at the side of Walcheren, so on the left side, this was one of the few places that was not flooded. So a lot of German troops actually had pulled back to this. So it was therefore also the best defended position. And it was very hard on the causeway was something like 800 meters long, 40 meters wide, without any protection. So it was also an extremely difficult position to attack. And the weird thing is as well, they had 3 attacks over the Sloedam, and only the final one did succeed. But once they actually started the third attack, there were already 2 secured beat hatches at Vlissingen and Westkapelle. So you can still wonder, was it still necessary to penetrate Wal from the third side? You can see it on the picture over here. The painting is actually made by one of the Canadian lieutenants who made a painting out of it, and it's actually offered to one of the museums in Walcheren. And the right center corner, you can also see this photograph. There's still a huge monument as well, commemorating the Sloedam, because it was an extremely costly and heavy fight as well. And again, but of course, in hindsight, as a historian, it's always easy to say it was not necessary anymore. They already had 2 secure beachheads. Then we have finally, if we talk about the Battle of Walcheren, that was the liberation of Middelburg. And that occurred on the 6th of November. 2 days later, the final Germans surrendered. So that was the final fighting on Walcheren. Middelburg was completely packed with refugees. There were 40,000 people in Middelburg. Well, normally only 7,000 people lived there. But all the refugees from the countryside had fled to Middelburg. And they were constantly under fire. And at a certain moment, there was a church surgeon from the hospital was so fed up with it that he took a canoe and he paddled to the Allied lines somewhere in the dunes. And he said, "Why are you still shooting at Middelburg? I know there are 2,000 Germans, but they're completely fed up. Send some troops and they will surrender." So on the 6th of November, there were 13 buffaloes, and buffalo is the symbol of the Battle of the Scheldt. It is an amphibious vehicle, actually mainly used by the Americans in the Pacific, constructed for the war against Japan. But it was the first, so it got its baptized with fire in the Battle of the Scheldt. And because there was so much water and so much that had been flooded, that the buffalo was a very important weapon. The story even was that when they were driving into Middelburg, one of them had struck a mine, so there were only 12 left. They had something like a little bit more than 200 men. The Germans were hearing the tracks, because they have tracks as well, and they can go to water. But they said, "Oh my God, the tanks are coming!" And all the Germans were surrendering. So 2,000 Germans surrendered to 200 Allied troops. But that again shows us that the Germans were indeed completely fed up with it. But that was a relief. Now, the mine sweepers, and only on the 28th of November, 65 days after the liberation of Antwerp, the first ships finally could enter the port. And so I think especially Montgomery had wasted too much precious time because he could have liberated the Scheldt much earlier, also with less cost. But on the next slide, you can also see some of the statistics. So you can see if you look at, so these are all the major harbors.
Yep.
And if you see Antwerp, you can see from November, the first ships entering, but you can already see in the next month and the months afterwards that a very large portion of all the supplies being sent to the Allied troops came to Antwerp. The city of Ghent is actually also a port that is on the Scheldt, which also became available. So it's definitely no exaggeration to say. Eisenhower also said, we know that the war was ended, and he also called this a blood transfusion for his troops. So important the Battle of the Scheldt was. We do know, for instance, that during the Battle of the Bulge, they were actually sending Christmas packets to the troops.
Yeah.
Now, this is a luxury you can only afford once you have enough ammunition and fuel. However, you can also argue, and this is something we do in our book, that the battle was not in fact over, because on the next slide, we can see that the main goal of the Battle of the Bulge was the conquest of Antwerp.
Yeah.
I would certainly don't call Hitler, he would call himself the greatest field marshal of all times. He made terrible blunders and mistakes. There's even the story that Churchill said, don't assassinate Hitler, because due to all his mistakes, it will shorten the war. But in this case, he had more an eye on logistics than Montgomery had. So this whole goal of Battle of the Bulge was reconquering Antwerp, which again tells us how important Antwerp was. So I always say on land, the battle of the Scheldt was not over. But also on the next slide, we can see on sea, the battle of the Scheldt wasn't over as well, because Hitler and especially Dönitz, the admiral of the navy, sent in enormous amount of what we call the little submarines, because the Scheldt is too shallow to send in big submarines. But they were sending in submarines coming up from the north in order to prevent shipping to Antwerp. They were either armed with torpedoes or with mines. Now, this is really what the Germans call the Himmelfahrtskommando. So it's an assignment that will definitely go to heaven. This is a one-man torpedo boat, the Biber. One young sailor would be sticking there. He would actually use crystal meth to stay awake for at least 24 hours. And many of them actually, because the little submarines are not very seaworthy, so many of them perished. This one is actually found after the war, and it's now with the remains of the crewmen still in there, and it's now on exposition as well in Vlissingen. And so from the sea, but finally also the next slide from the air. Hitler also ordered a massive bombardment of Antwerp. And we all know the V1 and V2 attacks on London, but Antwerp was the second city that was struck by.
Yeah.
In our book, we have the precise calculation, but it's almost to 10,000 rockets that are thrown at Antwerp. And we do know that at least 5,000 people were still killed, because although they were aimed at the harbor, most of them actually struck in the areas where people. There was one time actually that even a movie theater was struck, and many also civilians, but also military personnel of the Allied forces that were also hoping to watch a movie were also killed. So, in my perspective, the war actually, the Battle of the Scheldt, continued until April. And on the next slide, you can also see the appreciation that was actually given also to the people of Antwerp. On the top corner on the left, Winston Churchill made a trip to Antwerp shortly after the war, and he was cheered by all the people. But also when Truman and Eisenhower, which you can see on the other pictures, when they were traveling to Potsdam for the conference, they also went to Antwerp, and also to greet and to thank the civilians of Antwerp for their commitment and for their war effort, which actually was seen as so vital for the Allies as well. Next slide. Now, what about the Dutch? This is actually a map that is made by the Dutch Red Cross. This is actually the map of the Netherlands. Now, Zeeland is on the left corner. And everything that is in color is the areas of the country that are actually destroyed of severe destruction. And it's without any doubt that Zeeland is the most destruction in the whole Netherlands. And the intriguing thing is most people in the Netherlands are also not aware of it, because when the fighting was going on in Zeeland, the people in the north were still occupied, so they were not receiving any news and not any information. So that also contributed to the fact. But Zeeland, and you can see it on this picture, with all everything that has been flooded, has been the most severe destructed area in the country, in the Netherlands. So the next picture. This is actually what the people had to endure after the war. You see actually people living in German bunkers all up to almost 10 years after the war, because there was such a shortage of houses. You can see this is actually in the traditional clothing. When I moved to Zeeland 25 years ago, we could still see some women wearing traditional clothing. We don't see many more, but we immediately recognize this is Zeeland. Well, this is a farmer's wife. Now, can you imagine if you have a farm on Walcheren and everything is flooded? What salt water does to your soil? It was devastating. All the communication needed to be done by boats. It was really an enormous problem. On the next slide, we can actually see this was actually the situation after the war. So we have those 4 very big gaps in the water, in the dykes, and the water is simply going in and out. And the more water comes in and out, the wider the breach in the dykes would become. Now, there was even a story that the government first said, it will be impossible to restore Walcheren. Maybe we should simply leave it like this, evacuate all the people. But the Dutch have a history in fighting the sea and fighting the war. So even with the lack of equipment, with the lack of a lot of things, something like 3,500 men started with almost the impossible task to restore the dikes. And it took them actually in the end until the spring of 1946. So it's almost 1.5 years after the dikes were hit. After 1.5 years, they were able to close the dikes again, and then they still had to pump all the water out. So you can imagine what an enormous enterprise this must have been. That will also be a next documentary on the restoration of Walcheren. Yeah. Next slide, please. The intriguing thing about Walcheren, however, was, now you can see on the top left corner, this is how Walcheren looked after the war. But Walcheren, like I said, is very, very popular. So on the right corner, you can now see how the beaches now look today. And who are very fond of going to Walcheren? The Germans. So already 10 years after the war, massive German people were coming to Walcheren. And it's intriguing also the way that the people of Zeeland dealt with the war, because they were the enemies. All the destruction is done, well, a lot of them by the Allies as well, but as a consequence of the German occupation. And you can also see that well, maybe this is the pragmatic attitude of Zeeland. Well, the Germans are invading us again, but now in a peaceful manner. But we can also earn a lot of money from tourism. So actually they were welcome. But this is I think this is funny. On the top right corner, you see one of the bunkers in Zeeland, and it's chalked on it Zimmervrij, which actually was very famous in Zeeland. If you put on your window the sign Zimmervrij, it means rooms available. And it's in German, so it was actually pointed out at the German tourist, you can rent a room. And now they have painted it on a bunker, which is, of course, well, I think it's funny. You can still get a room in one of your former bunkers. Next slide, please. Why is this battle so forgotten? And I think one of the main, there are a couple of reasons. First, it has to do with logistics. And logistics is not very sexy, as I tend to say it. It's not that appealing. The big parachute operation in Market Garden actually gave much more, it's a dramatic story.
Yeah.
It much more is appealing. And logistics, is something in the back of your troops. But But the other main reason was, I think it's Canadian. This is a very famous book of Terry Cobb, The Cinderella Army. And I think this is really how the Canadians looked at themselves as well. We do all the dirty work, but we are not going to be invited to the party. I mentioned that the first convoy that entered Antwerp on the 28th of November. Now, when it arrived at the docks, there were many representatives of Montgomery's army group there. There were generals. Did you know who they did not invite? The people of the Canadian Army. So it's ridiculous, They do and the first ship was actually even a Canadian ship as well. So you see also the little bit of the irony. So that's important. There were very few Americans involved. That is also something that played a role, because American dominates history writing, but also what I call popular culture. There are no novels being written on the Battle of the Scheldt. There are no movies being made. And I also tend to believe that it was such a harsh fighting with so many casualties, with so much destructions, with also, I say, military errors, that it was also not the fight that people would look back later on, with pride, in a sense. Look how wonderful our operation was, how well we did all this. I think this played a role as well, also why this battle has been so much forgotten as well. Next slide, please. However, there are still many things to be seen, the remains of the Atlantic Wall, but there's still also a very big cemetery at Berg op Zoom. And that is also one of the icons of the Battle of the Scheldt. So if you ever visit this area, Berg op Zoom is the entrance. So it's not Zeeland, but the entrance of Zeeland, the first town when you leave Zeeland. And there they have the big cemetery. And there are many Canadians that fought in the Battle of Scheldt that they are buried over there. And the Canadians also considered themselves a very important place if they commemorate the Second World War. At least. Now, I think one of the main reasons why everybody knows about the Bridge too Far or the Battle of Arnhem is also due to movies, because we have written a book and it's been published in many copies. But if you want to really reach a much wider audience, you should actually have a picture, a movie picture. And I think the reason why the Market Garden and the Battle of Arnhem has become so famous is due to this movie of A Bridge Too Far, which is also a wonderful movie. But also very dramatic movie. Constantly with this idea, the war could have been shortened for months if only. Again, it's what if history, but I think it's also a great exaggeration.
Yeah.
But luckily, next slide. A couple of years ago, finally, the Battle of the Scheldt also received a picture, but it was a Dutch production. However, it has been also made available in English, and it's actually available on Netflix.
We had the producer on World War II TV talking about it back when it came out. So yeah, it's.
Well, you can also see there are some famous international actors also in there. He's also from Harry Potter.
Yeah.
But when it was actually published at Netflix, it was also the best movie for the first weekend in Vietnam and America, which is also intriguing. So apparently they enjoy European war movies as well, Vietnam. And the only problem is, I always say the Battle of the Scheldt is so complicated that it's almost impossible to grasp in a simple movie. But I'm happy to well, maybe even to announce that the makers of the movie are now also busy making a 3-volume documentary on the Battle. And also with reenactments. And I'm also, I'm not writing the script, but I'm helping the script writer as much as I can.
Brilliant.
So there will be many historical errors. And I also hope when it becomes an international production, it could also mean that more people actually can get more information about what the Battle of Scheldt actually was.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. In Zeeland itself, there's more and more attention being given. You can see in the right corner, 5 years ago, when there was 75 liberation of the Netherlands, it was the first time that they actually stood still on a national level, but even an international level, on the Battle of the Scheldt. Well, you probably don't recognize them, but the two people in the front is the Dutch king and the Belgian king. The Belgian king was also invited. And they started their commemorations in Zeeland, which was also a kind of a signal. Okay, we have neglected the Battle of the Scheldt so much, but we will start the commemorations of the 75 years here in the Netherlands. Now on top you can see one of the commemorations. This is actually again in Vlissingen, Uncle Beach, which is the landing beach where the Marines went on shore, and they still do this on a yearly occasion. And in the left corner, there's even now a huge museum in Zeeland. So if you would ever go to Zeeland, visit the museum as well. They have a buffalo, they have Sherman tanks, but it's a huge museum for Dutch standards. So they also you can get acquainted with the whole story of the Battle of the Scheldt going to the museum. But there are more museums. There are many more museums. They're all very small museums. Even museum where you can enter a bunker and where a couple of Germans would be living. So there are many things you can still see. Next slide, please. Now this is my final slide, and I always show this when I give a presentation to remember. Well, we had to fight a long way in order to get more acquaintance to the Battle of the Scheldt. But look in the top. Now I must admit this is false. The American president wasn't watching because it's the Dutch version of the movie. But I can say that the picture in the right corner is actually the right. And well, you probably don't recognize him, but he was the Dutch prime minister until recently. And he's a historian, and you can see that in his the Oval Office of our prime minister, you can actually see a copy of our books because we also presented a book to him, being a historian, and it has a very prominent place. Now he's no longer prime minister now, however, he's now our current Secretary General of the NATO. So we can be sure that there will be many attention still being given, maybe also in NATO circles, that nobody should actually forget the Battle of the Scheldt, because it was indeed one of the 5 important battles in Eisenhower's campaign to liberate northwestern Europe and to put an end to Nazi Germany.
Well, brilliant stuff, Tobias. We have a couple of more comments from the viewers rather than the questions. I think you've been answering the questions you've been going along, but Norma Graham, one of our Canadian viewers, Antwerp was worth it, but it was unfair to expect the depleted Canadian forces to fight such well-dug-in German enemy. Erwin, who I feel is from the Netherlands, he kind of slightly disagrees with about the fighting. He said the Germans defended every polder in West, I'm not going to pronounce that, Zeeuws-Vlaanderen in October 44, and that resulted in a severe battle which cost a lot of lives, both soldiers and civilians.
Can I respond, Paul, to the...
Yes, please.
Well, the first one, I totally agree. And this is, again, Montgomery simply stated, the Canadians can take care of it. And this is completely unfair because the Canadians were still stuck, in northern France. Yeah. They were short of troops. And there was at a certain moment, I even read it somewhere, there was so short of ammunition due to all the logistic problems that the cannons could only shoot 5 grenades a day. And in his memoirs, Montgomery is then also blaming the Canadians in a certain sense, I expected more from them, but this is indeed sincere nonsense. And only half October, when also Eisenhower was completely fed up about it, he actually forced Montgomery. And according to some, he was even threatening Montgomery that he had to resign if he wouldn't send reinforcements to Zeeland. And for instance, the 52 Lowland Division was then also sent. And it was really quite unfair the way the Canadians were treated. The second question, indeed, West-Zeeuws-Vlaanderen was Fortress South, which I already mentioned, and indeed it was extremely costly. Also because there were many bombardments, artillery bombardments, but the German division that was defending Fortress South, was one of the best divisions actually. Most of them were veterans from the East Front, and they had a very able general as well, General Ebeling. So this is also the reason why on the south of the mount, the fighting was so intense.
Okay. And then people are saying, like ABC, not freeing the Scheldt estuary earlier is a real head scratch. And I think that we can all agree. We've done shows on the channel recently about the battle for Brest, for Saint-Malo, the fights for Cherbourg. They're doing a Dragoon show later in the week about the importance of Marseille. But you kind of feel that a bit more focus on Antwerp earlier, and they kind of take off all that logistical pressure because Antwerp is got to be the prize, isn't it? But that's as you said earlier.
I like the quote of a British admiral who said, "No, the liberation of Antwerp was a great astonishment." But he called it's like an oasis in the desert.
Yeah.
And first, we had to get a way to get to the oasis to actually use the oasis.
Yeah, no, good point. And then we've got a question from, or a comment from Samuel Thompson. My question to the Dutch in World War II is, if the Allies didn't bother with the German 15th Army, the occupation would have dragged on much longer. War is destructive. So that's a comment there about the fact that whatever happens strategically, the Dutch are in the firing line, they're going to get losses, whatever happens, I suppose is fair to say, isn't it?
No, but again, I know from the German High Command that they more or less already had written off the 15th Army. So it's such a waste that they gave a free passage almost to the 15th Army. They did try to stop, because we also know that the Enigma, so the Allies actually knew at a certain moment that the Germans were retreating. What they did is try to stop it with aerial bombardments, and they started to bomb ports in Zeeland as well, which led again to many destruction on civilian lives, much more than to German lives.
Another one about the Reconstruction. Queen's own Cameron Hines Academy is asking, did they grow special crops to draw the salt out of the soil post-war?
Yeah, indeed. There's certain crops that are much able to stand with salt than others. And actually, they're still seen as something very typical from this region, and actually a very good taste. So certain vegetables with that can grow much better on salt.
Thank you. And then Norma's last comment is, the veterans barely remembered it. It was so traumatic, many of them blocked it out. They recall mud and rain and death. I think that's one of the things it's come up a lot on this channel, is that there are certain battles that are just so miserable to think about. They didn't talk about them at all. The Hurtgen for the Americans, perhaps the Battle of the Metz for certain American troops, the British fighting north of Aachen in this sort of time of the year in 80 years ago. So I think sometimes you need that story to be carried on by the veterans, and for tragic reasons they just put it behind them, I think.
Let me quote one Canadian soldier.
Please do.
He said, Zeeland is a god-awful place. 99% is water, and the 1% that isn't water has recently been water or will become water in a small amount of time. So Brilliant. This is the recollection there. The weather was also awful. So now it's quite understandable.
So my last question to you, Tobias, is, you talked about the increasing numbers of tourists are going to the area there, the fact they're preserving the bunkers, the commemorations have been well attended. Do you see a new generation of historians coming through to kind of start to get to grips from this from the German point of view and examine it? Because with all due respect to people like Terry Kopp, he's no longer a teenager. Do you have hopes for the history to be reevaluated over the next few years?
Oh, certainly. But the intriguing thing is, so I work at the university, so I'm an educated historian, but I don't believe in that, because we have many amateur historians who actually know much more about it than I do. There are some local amateur historians, and the same applies to Hans Sackers, the one that I wrote a book with.
Yeah.
He is a specialist on German sources, and they already published in the 90s very much a German perspective on the Battle of the Scheldt, because that is what we tried in our book as well. We constantly say this: there are three perspectives. We have the Allied perspective, which is very well covered by many literature in England and Canada. There's a German perspective, but also a civilian perspective. And we try to have all the three perspectives as much as possible in the book. I think this is the new approach on military history. But with the growing attention on the Battle of the Scheldt, I'm definitely sure that we will find more publications. And as a famous Dutch historian also said, history is a discussion without an end. So you should never pretend that you find everything, know everything. There will always become new sources. We find a lot of diaries that actually show that there's still a new insight and there's still new knowledge to be gathered.
Well, brilliant. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. Folks, the links to Tobias's book with his co-authors in the description below. You can check out other Dutch sources about this battle. But in the meantime, thank everybody for your fantastic questions. I'm back in a few hours' time with Nick Stanley, talk about that 2-month or 3-month minesweeping operations. That's the focus on the Royal Navy. Stephen Fisher is back tomorrow to talk about his view on the Walcheren. He's starting a book on the Scheldt campaign, following up his Sword Beach. And then we're back tomorrow morning as well with a show about the Australians in Tobruk. So thank you, Tobias. Thank you, viewers. I will see you in a few years' time. This is Paul Woodhouse for World War II TV saying thanks for watching. Cheers, everybody. Bye.